So let's go ahead and begin to talk about share repurchases, and then we'll move into doing some preparation for the qualitative exam next week. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint. And as we do this, I'm going to first show you an image of what the spreadsheet that I put together for Mira Drovanna looks like with respect to looking at share repurchases. There's a couple of things I need to point out first. What you're looking at on this first slide is the income statement, balance sheet, and a little bit of market information, of course. I want you to notice that I changed the share prices in the market from the 4 1/8 and 250 for common and preferred that we were looking at last week. And you'll remember that when we looked at these and went through the valuation funnel and found per share value for common equity and per share value for common preferred, and then we looked at goodwill, we identified that the market prices of the shares were grossly overvalued. We were finding prices of something along the line of $1.70 for common, value for $1.70 for common against a price of 4 1/8. And that's a gross distortion, of course. And we were seeing a price of 2.5 versus a value of 85 cents for preferred. So for the purpose of this example, I've gone ahead and changed those prices here. And you realize, of course, that when I change the price of these, it ultimately is going to ripple out and change the weighting of the WACC components, because we now will have a lower market cap of the common shares and market cap of the preferred shares, but we haven't changed the debt amount. So that's going to change the weights within our WACC equation. So where we did have a cost of capital of, I think it was 16.95%, you're going to find now when we look at this that the cost of capital as things stand has gone down into somewhere into the mid 14% range, if I remember correctly. So I just wanted to point that out. And then also, I'm pointing out to you that I've gone ahead and constructed a spreadsheet, and we'll be spending time in this spreadsheet, of course, where we are modeling share buybacks. So this is a share repurchase, but it's the re-envisioned Mira Drovanna example. And in this, you'll see in the yellow cells, you may have to go ahead and enter values, and I've gone ahead and entered values here, but everything else is formulaic or is pulling values from some other part of the spreadsheet. So let me go ahead and bring the spreadsheet up now, and we'll start to talk about this. Again, notice that I've got 2.3 and 1.15 for the common and the per share values. As I indicated, that took us to a lower WACC. I was thinking the WACC was in the 14% range. It's actually 15.35%, but still nicely lower than the 16.95% that we were seeing. And again, that's change is only a function of having changed the weights because we changed the market cap of the common. So let's go ahead and from here and open up the share buyback spreadsheet I put together. Now, I haven't shared this spreadsheet with you yet. I will at some point, but I'm sharing in the PowerPoint the basic structure as you can see it in an image. I'm going to walk you through so you can see what's going on here. I'm not going to share the spreadsheet with you yet because I want you to spend some time to try to re-envision this yourselves and to construct this yourselves. You're going to be having opportunities to use this, of course, and I'm not going to set this up immediately as an Excel assignment, but I do think it would be a good idea for you to not only understand what I'm going through here through this video today, but also to recreate this for yourself. There might be an opportunity here in the next week or two where that might become valuable to you if you've chosen to do it. So as I'm looking at this, I've given us a couple of columns here where I'm looking at the current condition. And there's two columns because in one column, I'm using a value estimate using the free cash flow model. And in the other column, I'm using a value estimate using the forward market multiple column or model. Remember, the different model forms will give us slightly different values. And in this case, the values are 172.78 and 173.8. So it's only slightly different values. But let me walk through this so you can see what I'm doing. And I'll just start here I've given it the number of common shares, and this is coming over directly from the financial statement, of course. And those are common shares. Same thing with preferred shares. And then I've given the preferred conversion rate, which I've already got embedded in the financial statement as well. And then I have this converted equity shares. So how do I get this? Well, remember that we have a conversion rate for preferred shares of 2-to-1. So for every 2 shares of preferred, I can convert that to 1 share of common. So what I've done is I've taken the preferred shares, divided them by the preferred conversion rate, and then added that value to the original common shares of 55.7, and that gives me the new common shares of 57.85. You can see here how I've done that, just exactly as I mentioned to you. I'm then going ahead and just bringing it over from the value without adjustment sheet. I'm bringing over the estimated value using the free cash flow model. So I've shown it to you right here. And then I'm bringing over the debt from the income statement, or excuse me, I'm bringing over the debt from the financial statement sheet where we went ahead and calculated the market value of debt. So this isn't directly from the balance sheet. This is coming over from our calculated market value of debt. And then I'm pulling cash off of the balance sheet, and then I'm calculating equity. Well, let's think about how we've done that, of course. We're using the enterprise value equation, market cap of common plus market cap of preferred plus market value of debt minus cash. And I'm simply re-engineering this such that instead of solving for the estimated enterprise value, I'm now going to solve for the equity value. I know the enterprise value from having estimated it through the model. I know the debt value having estimated that through our bond value equation and the balance sheet. I know cash from the balance sheet, and so I can go ahead and then re-envision this and say that equity, which you and I know means equity in terms of common shares and market value of equity in terms of preferred shares combined, and it gives us 124.989. So this is the combined market value of the equity shares. So how do I break this down into a per share value or a per share price? So I've gone ahead and here in cell B26, I'm giving us the per share common value, not price, value. And I do that by taking these equivalent converted equity shares and dividing them into this equity amount. So I take the equity amount and divide it by the equity shares. And it gives me the $2.16. And then I can take and estimate a per share of preferred value by employing the conversion ratio. So I can take that same amount that I've got for common, knowing that 2 shares of preferred equals 1 share of common, and I can divide that amount that I have of value per common, divided by the conversion ratio, and it gives me the then estimated value for preferred. Well, let's contrast these for just a moment with the price for common and price for preferred. Obviously, the price for preferred shares is $2.30 in the market. That was reflected in the financial statement up front. But our value is $2.16. So in this case, we're valuing the per share common equity slightly lower than the rest of the market is. Well, that shouldn't necessarily surprise us. That's not uncommon. There's always little disparities between value and price. And similarly, for the preferred, we have valued it at $1.08, but the price in the market is $1.15. So this means that we valued it slightly less than the market has. I don't know that that's enough to cause us to say, stay away from this stock, but it's also not enough for us to say, this stock's very interesting to me. I'd be more interested in it if we had valued the common stock at a higher dollar value than the market has, in which case I'd be more inclined to go ahead and buy some of that stock. But we're fairly close to the same number regardless. In this next section, I'm going ahead and considering the tangible assets on the balance sheet versus the intangible assets or goodwill, and market value of the liabilities and owner's equity. Remember that assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. And we know assets come in two forms. There's tangible assets and intangible assets. And we call intangible assets very often goodwill. And in this case, we know the value of the tangible assets. They're on our financial statements. We can see it right here. The value of the tangible assets combined is 168.073. But what I don't know is the value of the intangible assets. And so I want to find that. So I know that if tangible assets plus intangible equals liabilities plus owner's equity, then I can rearrange that equation to say that intangible assets, or goodwill, equals liability plus owner's equity minus tangible assets. So that's what we've done in calculating goodwill. But we need to be specific here and reference how we got the owner's equity. Owner's equity and the equity that we calculated for the common and preferred combined is the same number. So if I take the outstanding value of all of my common shares, the outstanding value of all of my preferred shares, and combine them, that number that I get should also be the value, the market value of owner's equity. So when I have that number, then I'm able to reverse engineer, and I see that my initial condition for the company before a share buyback was that we had goodwill of 53.05. We had common shares of $2.16 per share value and preferred shares of $1.08 per share value. I'm guessing that'll make sense to you. We've gone over this kind of process a couple of times now already, but this is the first time that you've seen me do it in this kind of a spreadsheet format. And again, I think it'd be a good idea for you to try to replicate this, or at least have a good understanding of what's going on so that you can use this kind of a structure in the future. So I've got a couple of things going on here in addition to having highlighted some of the values in yellow. And again, the highlighted values are ones that you're going to input as original input numbers in this sheet. Everything else came from other sheets or by calculations, including these items I have shaded in light blue or this gray blue. And I only have those shaded. So including items that I have shaded in this light gray or this gray blue into the new and old WACC, and then new and old values using a free cash flow and a forward market multiple construction that I've borrowed from one of the other sheets here. The reason I have these in blue or blue-gray is they're not original input values to this sheet, but they're things I'll be pointing out. I think they're worth looking at, such as you'll notice that we had the original WACC of 15.35, and we saw that when we looked at the financial statement in a moment. And you're about to see that WACC is going to change to 13.8 as a byproduct of this financial engineering through a share buyback that we're doing. You're going to see that WACC changes, that the original value using the free cash flow model was 172.79, let's say, and moves to 201.78 because of that financial engineering. Well, that's not a trivial move. Remember that we're valuing this in millions, so that's almost a $30 million move because we did this share repurchase. We'll come back and look at these in a moment. Everything else I have here is just so that you can see what's going on, so you can see some of the differences, and maybe so we can calculate them to put them into some of these new, into some of these cells. So let's look at what's happening here. So I'm doing a post share repurchase condition here. So this now is after the share repurchase. And in this, I'm saying that we're buying back 10 shares or 10 million shares. We're buying them back at a price of $2.10 per share for the common. Well, that's interesting. I'm suggesting right here that we can buy them back at $2.10, but I'm suggesting that their market price, and you'll see that down here, was also $2.10. Oh, but that's not accurate. So the market price should be showing in at $2.3 for the common and $1.15 for the preferred. So that's going to change a couple of little things here for us, not a lot though. But I'm saying we're buying them back at $2.10. Well, how can I say that? Normally, we buy shares back at a premium to the market. But in this case, we're arguing that we had a value of less than the 230. So I've gone ahead and put in a number of 210 here, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I will have to pay more. Maybe I'm even going to have to pay 240. So I can change that value here. I'm going to change it to 2.4. And you'll notice that it not only changed it here, but changed it in the column directly next to it, and it changed our WACC. Well, again, it changed our WACC because we now have a different structure for our weights. And we were at 13.8%, and it moved us to 14.15. Still nicely lower, and we still have a nice value change here. In this case, not by the $30 million, but by about $22 million or so. So let's continue on. So we're saying that we're buying back 10 million shares of common. We believe we're going to have to pay $2.40 a share for them, which if they're currently trading at $2.30, that's not at all unusual. We're almost always going to have to pay a bit of a premium. If for no other reason, then we're coming to the market with some demand for 10 million shares. That's 20% or so of the outstanding shares of the company. So that'd be a big increase in demand on any given day in the market. And so when demand rises in the face of supply not having changed, we see that price changes. So this doesn't surprise us in the least then. As we continue on, that would suggest a preferred price per share then of $1.02 because of our conversion factor. And if we're buying back that 10 million shares at 2.4, we're going to have to pay $24 million to do it. So we're going to be required to raise $24 million of capital. And that's just the share volume of the buyback times the price per share that we had to buy them back for. I've gone ahead and given you the opportunity here to model using cash for some of this and using debt for some of this. I'm going to go through this example using all cash, or excuse me, using all debt. So we're going to borrow this in the marketplace. But the way I've set this model up, we could go ahead and put in some dollar amount of cash that we have on hand. In fact, I could say, well, we've got almost $11 million. Maybe I would agree that we only need $5 million of that. So I'll go ahead and say we'll use $5 million of cash to help us effect this purchase. And when I do so, notice that it changes the dollar amount of the debt that we're going to have. And that then obviously is a WACC issue as well. But as I said, we're going to model this one as though we're borrowing the money. And so we're going to borrow $24 million. And in this case, let me change the amount that we're borrowing it at to the current yield as it currently exists. And then we'll also change the beta back to the current beta. If you looked at the income statement balance sheet or the financial statements, you'll see it was 1.36. And if we have the same current yield on the debt that we had before the share repurchase, and if we have the same beta we had before the share repurchase, then it's going to result in going through this funnel, which I'll go through in a moment, but it's going to result in a new WACC of 13.49 as opposed to the 15.35% that we had originally. Well, again, that's changing our values. And now we see that our value has increased to 208.6 against the original value before this of 172.8, or about a $36 million improvement. That's not trivial. I don't care who you are. But I'm not sure that we could argue that the current yield that we used to have of 6%, which was the cost of borrowing that the company had before thinking about this share buyback, would be valid now, because we're about to add $24 million in debt. Now remember that the company had $58.73 million in the market value of debt. And adding 24 million to that is adding what, a 45% debt load to this? So this is a monumental shift in the company's debt load. And I've got to believe that that's going to bring about a required rate that's higher than the 6% that we're currently paying. In fact, I would expect that, assuming that that's the only change that's really happening for the company, that there's no other creditworthiness problem, no other market shift, etc., that we probably would end up paying, instead of 6%, something more along the lines of 7%. Notice that as I made that change, I'll do it again. So I was at 6%, but I want you to watch what's happening over here to the market value of the bonds. So as I change this from 6 to 7, I'm now recalculating the market value of the bonds. So as the rate goes up, the bond value goes down, and you see that it went down from about $54 million for the bonds down to a little over $50 million. Well, that would make sense to us. We understand that that would be the case. We went from $17.84 per bond to $16.43 per bond just because the interest rate changed in the current market. The coupon rate didn't change. Nothing else was altered here. Just the current yield, the interest rate in the current market, and of course that informs yield to maturity in the bond value equation. Well, that then gives me a total debt amount of 78.45. And remember, this amount was 58.73, but that was before we changed the current yield, and it was before we borrowed an extra $24 million. So if we look at how I got to this 78.45, I'm taking now this new market value of bonds, and since that's expressed as a real dollar amount, I have to divide it by 1,000,000 in order to get it into the right scale. And then I'm picking up from the financial statements the non-bond debt that this company has, and then I'm adding the debt that we're picking up. So the debt we're picking up is already at its own market value. We're borrowing it at that dollar amount in the market now, so that is its market value. And so I'm taking market values and adding them to market values, and I've got now a debt structure of 78.45. Well, that's a lot. That's a lot. We added $24 million, and we had a change in current yield. I'm also going to think about changing the beta factor. Now look for a moment. Changing the current yield alone and recognizing that borrowing the extra money has brought about a shift in the weights that we've got, has gone ahead and changed our WACC to 13.99%. Now that's a little bit more than it was a few moments ago when we still used a 6% current yield, but it's not a lot different. Look at what's going on with the weights over here. We had values of 66.8% for common, but once we repriced the common to 2.4 instead of 2.3, now we've got weights of 56.74% for common. We didn't reprice, well, I guess we did reprice the preferred shares and went from 2.6 or 2.58% before the repricing and before the buyback to 2.67%. So this is just adjusting the proportional amount of the firm's capital components that are held in common stock versus those held in preferred stock versus those in debt. And notice that we were at just over 30% in terms of our debt weighting, and our debt weighting's now gone up by almost exactly 10% to just over 40%. So that rearrangement of weights is largely responsible for this reduction in WACC, but there's also an issue of having changed the current yield on the debt to 7%, because we just don't believe that when we're adding that much debt to the company that we're going to be able to borrow it at the same 6% we could have borrowed before this shift. Maybe we should talk for a moment about why it is that we would expect there to be a higher rate. Well, I think you can understand very briefly or very quickly that when a client, whether it's an individual client or a company as a client, when their debt load rises, they are at more of a risk of being able to pay that. Not only because they're going to have to pay it back someday, and it's going to take more cash flow to pay it back over the years. It's going to take a better, brighter future to pay back a higher amount of cash flow or a higher debt level. But also because there's periodic debt servicing. In this case, it's a bond, so it would be semi-annual, but if it was some other kind of debt, it might be monthly. And if the company is operating at a good operating margin, a good EBIT, but then faces some financial shocks, not unlike the ones that we're facing right now with the coronavirus, that additional debt load puts the company in a little bit of jeopardy because it takes less of a financial shock for the company to now not be able to afford to make its debt service payments. In fact, it's worth noting here that one of the greatest concerns that we have over the coronavirus issue isn't just what it's doing to the stock market. It's not just what it's doing to the unemployment markets, although those are correlated here. It's that because of the shock and because of lower consumer demand for anything that's being produced in our economies, both domestically and globally, we're concerned that there may not be enough cash flow for some of these companies to as easily make their debt service payments. In fact, some of them may go into default. Well, that makes sense to us, but we didn't know that was going to be the case when they were issued that debt. But if we're issuing them even more debt, we have to be considerate of these kinds of shocks, or just by some business decline, which is going to make it harder for them to make their debt service payments. So it puts them a little bit more on the edge, a little bit more at risk. So it warrants a higher cost of debt or a higher return to the lender. And that's what the 7% is about. So let's now go ahead and walk through this funnel, if you will, that I've put together with respect to coming up with the equity values and the goodwill value. So I've gone ahead now and I restate the common shares outstanding, which are 10 million shares less. So I took the original shares of 55.7 and I subtracted from them the 10 million shares. And you can see how I've done that in this equation, picking up the original shares from the financial statements and then picking up the 10 million shares here. It's just subtracting. This doesn't change the number of preferred shares outstanding, but we still have to think about the conversion ratio of preferred. And when I've got a 2-to-1 conversion ratio, if I want to take those preferred shares and think about an equity common share equivalent, I've got to go ahead and divide that by 2, so that now my converted equity equivalent shares have gone from 57.85 to 47.85. Well, that makes sense to us. We bought back 10 million shares from the market. There's 10 million shares outstanding fewer today than there was when we looked at this under the current condition. And we know that we've seen a change in the value of the company because of this changed WACC. Well, let's go just a little bit further here and let's challenge whether or not that WACC is still credible for us. We considered the effect of the interest rate or current yield, but I think also that if the company's taking on a lot more debt and it's having to pay a higher interest rate for that debt, that we might suppose that the beta factor will change as well. Remember that beta is a volatility measure of the company's common stock price in the market. I think it's reasonable to expect that if the market is supposing that it knows, if the market knows the company's taking on more debt and knows it's going to have a higher debt service payment, knows that it's going to be that much harder to meet the debt service payment, then it's reasonable that the volatility measure is likely to increase as well. And I'll tell you that a small change in volatility is a big deal, not only to the markets, but also to the value of WACC. So take a look over here. Remember that right now, the new WACC is 13.99. As I move this from 1.36 beta, which is right off the original conditions, to 1.38, I go from 13.99% WACC to 14.15. So that's a 0.16 move in our WACC. Well, it's a 0.16 move because I had an RE of 20.93%, and now my RE has moved up to 21.21%. So that's a decent move in the cost or expected return on equity, and it's bringing about a fairly substantial change in WACC. So when I did that, it's gone ahead and changed the value of the company again. I was originally at 172.78. I'm now at 194.6. So what's that? $22 million still. And so we've brought about a $22 million overall value change in the company just by buying back some shares and recognizing the rippling effect that that has in some of the other elements of the company's capital construction. So let's keep going here. So that brings about a 194.6 value against the estimated value. I've got 78.45 in the market value of my debt now. You'll recognize that changed a little bit because our cost of capital changed, and so the market value of our debt changed against 10.93 in cash. And so as I take the estimated value minus debt plus cash, I then get a overall equity value of 127.08 for this company's common and preferred shares combined. Once again, I want to see what that does to the value per share. Well, I was at 2.3 in the price. We were at 2.16 in the value before the change, but making this change increases the per share value to 2.656. So not only will we have reduced the number of shares outstanding in the market, which, by the way, when you reduce the number of shares outstanding in the market, the remaining shareholders' percentage overall holding of the company, so the proportion of the company that the remaining shareholders own, each goes up. So if I owned 20% of the company and I get rid of some of the outstanding shares in the market but none of my own, then my percentage of the overall holding of the company increases. So I've not only increased my overall percentage of the holding of the company, but I've increased my per share value. So as an equity stakeholder, as a common equity stakeholder, I was nicely benefited by the company choosing to do this. We have to remember why companies choose to make this kind of move. They do so because they're responsible to protect or enhance the value that the common equity shareholders have. That's the fiduciary responsibility. And it's the legal responsibility of the board of directors and the CEO to those common equity shareholders. So if it had done something other than improve my condition here, so if it had done something other than give me a better percentage ownership of the whole company, or if it hadn't given me a better overall financial standpoint, part of which is reflected in this per common equity share, per common share value, then the board of directors would have had to say, no, don't do this. Well, I've got the same kind of effect happening here for my preferred shares. So I divide this 2.656 by 2. That's the ratio, of course. And it gives me the preferred share value of 1.328. Here, I can contrast those numbers of 2.656 versus the price in the market of 2.3. And now I see that we really have a value in the value of these shares that's meaningfully greater than the price in the market. And we see a similar disparity for the preferred as we do for the common. So let's talk about what's likely to happen now. So which do you suppose would take place if we have a price in the market lesser than the actual value that we should be able to recognize for these shares? Is it likely that the value will fall to reach the market price, or that the market price will rise to meet the value? Well, I think we agree that it's more likely that the market price will rise to meet the value per share, because market agents are going to recognize what this firm has done in its buyback, recognize that that was a value enhancement of the company. They're going to reassess that value, and they're going to be willing to pay more for the shares. But remember that we paid more than their value was originally. We paid 2.4 in this, and when we paid that, it was more than the market price of 2.3, and it was more than the estimated value of 2.16. Well, why were we willing to do that? In part because we knew that what we were doing would actually give us an even better value than the 2.4 price that we were paying. So even though we paid up, we actually ended up getting something worth yet more still. Let's go back through our asset structure here to find goodwill now. And remember, we know the tangible assets from the balance sheet. We know the market value of the liabilities, because we know that not only from the balance sheet, but also from the estimated increase in the long-term debt. And the reason that this number of 115.86 is greater than the value that we're showing here for the long-term debt of 78.45 is because we have some current liabilities we've had to add to that. So this market value of debt now, given the new borrowing, given the change in WACC, so this market value was 78.45. If we add to it the current liabilities from the balance sheet, it gives us an overall market value of liabilities of 115.85 or 86. And we then know that the firm's equity has gone up. We saw that right here. The firm equity goes up from 126 to 127. And so that means that we now can reverse this equation such that intangible assets or goodwill will equal market value of liabilities plus market value of equity minus the tangible assets. So our equity has gone up here then from 53.05 to 74.86. Well, this is interesting. In fact, I think it points out a really interesting condition for the firm that you wouldn't necessarily know in exactness unless you modeled it. And I think this gives you a sense of how companies through financial engineering can improve shareholder value and improve overall value. But just by virtue of improving overall value doesn't mean that we've improved shareholder value. Shareholder are common shareholders in this case. We could have improved the value of the company, but if so much of it had been in the debt structure and not as much in the equity side, we may have actually harmed the common shareholders. And had we done that, then that would have been in violation of our fiduciary responsibility. So one of the things we might want to think about here is what happens to those shares that we buy back from the marketplace. Well, let's remember that when a company issues shares to begin with, it does so by virtue of a vote of the board of directors and by approval of the various state and federal regulatory bodies, the state divisions of securities and FINRA and the SEC. Well, let's assume for a moment that a company goes and does all the documentation to be allowed to issue 100 million shares of common stock in the marketplace. It doesn't mean that they're going to issue all 100 million shares. They're going to keep some of those back for stock option pools, and they're going to keep some of them back in treasury stock for future share offerings to the market. So those shares that are not actually issued out to the market, so the shares that are not outstanding in the market, are considered treasury stock. And they're just held in arrears, if you will, for the company to be able to issue if the company would like. They're not added into the market cap of the company's common stock because that's all about outstanding stock. They don't sit with any specific notation necessarily on the balance sheet. They just exist as treasury stock. And in the future, we may choose to, again, issue some of them out as stock options or issue some of them out as newly issued stock in secondary offerings and such. So I think this gives you a pretty good understanding of what's happening here. I'm going to ask you to spend some time trying to model this spreadsheet. And again, I think that here within a couple of weeks, you'll be grateful that you did.